A question. Is it to be taken as an attunement, or is its seizure going hand in hand with attunement? By being seized, somehow tuned, and in order to be affected at all, seized by the very question and questioning, a being in tune belongs fundamentally to it, according to Heidegger. Only out of this being in tune, we are at all granted to allow this questioning to occur, to arrive, to happen to us. This kind of questioning, to let it speak forth, to let it concern and address us, and to let it take up its hold on us, to take up this train, this trade, this pull, to let there be the pull of a leeway or into a leeway, to let there be the arrival of a way, a path, to think through the Occidental thinking in relation to the other. This is what Heidegger is after. To draw a historical fault line in relation to a particular way of thinking of the Western tradition as such, to trace a sensibility and an axis after it, the other, in the Western tradition itself. What does it actually mean to be? Heidegger asks. To have a world as an existential stretching out, an existential occurrence, an existential event, a being there cropping up, there being in the world, being thrown into it, and to be able, no, to have to relate to it, to trace back anxiety to its fundamental meaning traits, its fundamental pull of meaning, its meaning bits, its fundamental sense command, that it then becomes possible at all to ask, in quotation marks, I try to look at the world from a different perspective, but how? One could paraphrase Heidegger by pointing out that the question after about being, the question of the meaning of being, as Heidegger called it, was not even asked, but when it was asked implicitly by the tradition, was ever misdirected. But it shows in what surrounds us on a daily basis, in everyday life, that there's also something else, something uncanny taking place. And this also something else, this no thing, we have to let us be concerned by it, first of all, to then be able to comport ourselves to it. Not to grasp it immediately or directly, but rather to open up to it and to let something of being break loose, break open. But this can't be done or achieved by an act of will. This is not a question of the will or of willingness. Rather, what is necessary or what is in need is an abandonment, a surrender to this realm, to this abyss. In true anxiety, everything else becomes meaningless, Heidegger points out. How can that actually be the case? How is this possible? Philosophy is not free to decide which moods open up which questions to it, Heidegger says. Where I, as the questioner, find myself met and affected, included by way of being drawn in by a trait, a pull, a rupture of what this question speaks of, where it speaks from, a question that can only arrive, open up and show itself where it concerns me myself. A metaphysical questioning does not add being concerned just after the fact. My being concerned is rather fundamental to it. It's independent from any sense of annex. Then one must already be concerned in the first place, so that this question can arise or arises in its performative trait. Then one must already have contact to this question, where it speaks from and where it speaks of, and that which we ask after or towards. In quotation marks, one asks already as someone who is included, Heidegger points out, who is touched, who is meant, who is determined and included in the question, who is addressed. This points or indicates a point of view that this question, the question about being or after being and after the world, already means something before we even ask it. The question of deep boredom arrives. A question in which something negative enters or inscribes itself, a question that we have to ask in modernity and that we can only ask in such a mood, that is, deep boredom. Philosophy asks quite a certain circle of question, Heidegger points out, in their basic or fundamental moods and attunements. Concerning the objects I investigate, the question of essence does not arise at all, because the objects are constructed in it of science. They are being constructed, or their being constructed is made possible by science. The question of essence does not come at all into the realm that the sciences construct, in quotation marks. Is this now an empirical acceptance, distillate, to which we must submit? Does this exempt us from constructing a coherence or a coherent, comprehensive concept of life, from claiming to say something about the world? The question of the world brings us to a comparative consideration, says Heidegger, and this opens us to the question of being, first of all, beginning of the metaphysical questioning about the world. A question about the world, or a questioning of the world, about the worlding of the world, about the beginning, and about the basic fundamental moods and attunements. With Heidegger said the things being through these pictures that technoscience provides us with, that technoscience renders. They unfold their being with and on the basis of these pictures, the scientists, the scientific standpoint, the having of a world, a historical and skillful figure with consequences for the notion of world. It's not a general notion of world. It's not even a general world, but our understanding of world is subject to the very conditions of this very worlding. The having of world is shaped by the forming, designing, forming, and founding of world. And it's coming into speech, it's entering and its evocation in the event of truth, in the event of language. The human being now not as a piece of world, not to be conceived as of a piece of the standing reserve, of the concentration of all positionality, a being and beingness among beings, because we understand ourselves in and by means of our world, form it and make it accessible in the first place. We move in the world as the world moves us, in terms of moods, in terms of fundamental attunement. What surrounds us in it? How do we encounter the worlding of the world? How does the worlding of the world encounter and hit us? It's strikingly that the historical and phenomenal perspective unfolds different questions and contain different methods, the different relations of world of these three moments. The question of perspective and perspective taking, a change of the gaze and the trajectory of the gaze. Then the previous perspective established reference between God and the world, and now, however, it is about the phenomenal surface and depth, a request towards the world that presents itself and takes place within a phenomenal realm, a phenomenal place and site, exhibits a structure of reference, referential occurrence and occurring, an opening to the perspective of being and time. It's possible to take up different references to this worlding of the world, which would have to be brought together within their diversity, which means to prevent representation, means to present sense. In quotation marks, the question of having a world and that of consciousness is problematic, because implicitly one has with the latter at once a world which is itself a moment of consciousness. The human being who faces the world, and this world is a representational moment of a consciousness, which gathers a world of objects in the world and lets them be present in time. This leads to the question of judgment, that this something is something, but not to the question of something as something.